The Lorraine countryside in mid-September 1944 was wrapped in a thick, rolling fog. Fields that had seen centuries of quiet farming were now scarred by tank tracks and the thunder of artillery. Hidden in this mist, 5 American Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division sat silently, engines idling low, their crews straining to hear through the muffled stillness. Unbeknownst to them, a column of German Panthers, part of the newly arrived 113th Panzer Brigade, was advancing through the haze, expecting to crush anything in its path. The Germans believed their heavily armored Panthers, boasting high-velocity 75mm guns and thick frontal plating, were unbeatable in open combat. They did not expect resistance from a handful of Shermans. Yet in this battle, numbers would not tell the story. Terrain, weather, and above all, tactical ingenuity would turn a seemingly impossible mismatch into one of the most astonishing victories of the war. The Shermans, often dismissed as undergunned and underarmored, had something else on their side. Crews hardened by months of combat, supported by superior American doctrine that emphasized flexibility and initiative. On that foggy morning near Arracourt, these factors would combine to overturn German confidence in their armored superiority. Before we continue deeper into this remarkable story, make sure you like this video and subscribe, so you won't miss the rest of this epic tale where we break down how 5 Shermans defied the odds and humiliated an entire Panzer Brigade. As the German tanks crept forward, their commanders assumed the fog cloaked them in invincibility. What they didn't realize was that the same mist concealed their adversaries, 5 Shermans lying in wait, ready to ambush. The battlefield was a chessboard, and for once, the Germans did not hold the initiative. What followed would shatter their faith in the Panthers' invulnerability and prove that technology alone could not decide victory in mechanized warfare. This was not just a skirmish. It was the opening act of a clash that exposed the limits of German heavy armor and revealed the underestimated power of American tactical doctrine. The Lorraine fog would lift, and with it, the myth of German invincibility would begin to unravel. The German 113th Panzer Brigade entered the Lorraine campaign in September 1944 with its confidence at its peak. Formed hastily, but equipped with the formidable Panther tank, this unit represented Germany's hope to regain momentum on the Western Front. Many of its officers believed they would slice through the inexperienced Americans, much as their predecessors had crushed opponents during the Blitzkrieg years. The Panther, with its long-barreled KWK-42 L-70 gun and 80mm frontal armor, had a fearsome reputation. German commanders assured their men that American Shermans were little more than tin cans waiting to be destroyed. But this confidence masked dangerous weaknesses. The 113th was filled with raw recruits who had little combat experience. Their training had been rushed, their cohesion fragile, and their knowledge of combined arms warfare incomplete. The brigade's leaders envisioned decisive breakthroughs, but ignored logistical difficulties. Panther tanks consumed vast amounts of fuel, and Germany's dwindling reserves meant every movement carried risk. Still, orders from higher command pushed them forward. Strike the Americans, seize ground, and prove that the Wehrmacht still had strength left in it. The Panther crews rolled into Lorraine under the cover of fog, believing the mist would shield them from detection. Instead, it blinded them to the dangers ahead. Unknown to them, the American 4th Armored Division had already established defensive positions, and U.S. crews had learned how to fight smart against Panthers. The Germans imagined their overwhelming firepower would guarantee victory, but their lack of reconnaissance meant they were walking into an unseen battlefield puzzle. What the brigade's men did not yet realize was that American doctrine emphasized initiative at the platoon and company level. While German Panthers relied on carefully orchestrated assaults, the Shermans were trained to react swiftly, exploit terrain, and coordinate with artillery and aircraft when possible. This fundamental difference meant that even with numerical superiority, the Germans were entering an engagement where agility and decision-making could outweigh sheer firepower. As the 113th Panzer Brigade advanced into the fog, its soldiers still carried illusions of dominance. They thought of themselves as the heirs of Guderian's armored spearheads, unstoppable and merciless. Yet within hours, that illusion would be shattered. The battlefield of Arracourt would not reward arrogance. It would reward adaptability. And that was precisely what the Americans had in abundance. The morning of September 19, 1944, was drenched in heavy fog that blanketed the rolling fields of Lorraine. Visibility dropped so low that tank commanders could barely see beyond their gun barrels. For the Germans of the 113th Panzer Brigade, this seemed a blessing. The cover would mask their advance, concealing the dreaded silhouettes of their Panthers until they were nearly upon the enemy. But for the Americans, the fog was not a threat. It was an opportunity. Colonel Bruce Clark of the 4th Armored Division understood that he could not match German armor in a direct duel. Instead, he drilled his crews to fight smarter. American tankers positioned their Shermans behind ridgelines, hedgerows, and farm buildings, using every fold in the earth to mask their presence. The fog turned Arracourt into a giant chessboard, and Clark intended to control the pieces. He instructed his men to hold fire until the Panthers were almost on top of them, then strike with coordinated volleys before slipping back into cover. The crews of the 5 Shermans tasked with covering one of the key approaches knew their role perfectly. Each vehicle was stationed in a staggered line, their guns pre-aimed at likely avenues of advance. Spotters dismounted and crawled ahead on foot, straining their ears for the rumble of Maybach engines. The air was thick with tension, the fog amplifying every sound into a looming threat. Some tankers later recalled how the silence before the clash was worse than the battle itself, every second stretching into an eternity as they waited for the Panthers to emerge. But these American soldiers were not afraid. By 1944, they had seen enough combat to understand that the Sherman survival depended not on brute strength, but on cleverness. They trusted in their artillery, which stood ready to rain shells on exposed Panthers. They trusted in their radios, which allowed instant communication across the battlefield. And most of all, they trusted in their training, which taught them never to fight on the enemy's terms. When the first outlines of German tanks finally materialized through the fog, the Sherman's crews tightened their grips on the triggers. The moment had come. 5 American tanks were about to challenge dozens of Panthers, not with superior guns or armor, but with timing, teamwork, and cunning. The silence of Lorraine shattered in an instant. Out of the fog rolled the broad silhouettes of Panther tanks, their tracks grinding through wet earth, exhaust fumes swirling like shadows. The Germans, confident that no American machine could withstand them, pushed forward without hesitation. But the fields ahead were not empty. Behind a ridge, 5 Shermans lay in wait, their crews watching through slit periscopes as the predators walked into their trap. The order to fire came not with shouting, but with discipline. At nearly point-blank range, the Shermans erupted in a thunderous volley. Armor-piercing rounds streaked across the mist, slamming into the exposed flanks of the lead Panthers. One German tank burst into flames, its crew scrambling out under the roar of secondary explosions. Another Panther spun its turret wildly, caught completely unaware by the Americans' concealed position. For a moment, chaos overtook the German column. Fog concealed the Shermans' exact positions, making it seem as though fire came from everywhere at once. Tank commanders shouted over faulty radios, desperately trying to organize a response. The Panthers' long 75mm guns were deadly in open ground, but here, in broken terrain and poor visibility, their advantage meant little. Their shots whistled into empty fields, shattering barns and hedgerows, but rarely finding their mark. Inside the Shermans, nerves turned into focus. Each crew worked with machine-like rhythm, loader slamming shells into the breach, gunner adjusting elevation, commander scanning for the next target. The key was not to linger. After every few shots, the Shermans shifted position, disappearing behind another fold of earth before the Panthers could zero in. The Germans fired at ghosts. Within minutes, 2 more Panthers were disabled, their hulks smoldering in the mist. What should have been a crushing assault now looked like a confused retreat. Survivors tried to reverse, their engines groaning as they sought safety. But the Americans pressed, their 17mm guns finding weak spots in side armor, their coordination amplified by constant radio chatter. The clash revealed the stark truth. The German numerical advantage meant little against disciplined ambush tactics. 5 Shermans, dismissed by German propaganda as fragile and inferior, had just ripped open the pride of the 113th Panzer Brigade. The battlefield, once expected to deliver a swift German triumph, was already tilting toward the Americans, and the Battle of Arracourt had only just begun. The wreckage of burning Panthers cast an eerie glow through the fog, their towering hulks spewing black smoke into the sky. For the German 113th Panzer Brigade, the opening minutes at Arracourt were nothing short of a nightmare. Reports filtered back in fragments, enemy fire from concealed positions, tanks lost before the first salvo, officers cut off in the confusion. Yet, true to Wehrmacht discipline, the brigade did not collapse. Their commanders barked orders, trying to restore cohesion. Columns shifted formation, Panthers spread across the terrain, and artillery batteries were called to pound suspected American positions. The Germans believed that weight of firepower could regain control. Panthers moved cautiously now, turrets swiveling, guns probing the mist. But their Achilles' heel soon became clear. Communication. Only a fraction of the German tanks carried functioning radios, leaving platoons reliant on visual signals that vanished in the fog. Confusion spread like wildfire, and units often blundered straight into American crosshairs. In contrast, the Shermans never fought as isolated machines. Each tank remained in constant radio contact with its comrades, their movements choreographed with precision. If one Sherman spotted a Panther, its warning instantly echoed across the platoon, allowing others to reposition or flank. It was not the individual power of a Sherman that mattered. It was the collective voice of many, speaking as one. Colonel Bruce Clark exploited this difference ruthlessly. When the Germans regrouped for a counterattack, Clark ordered his men to shift positions entirely. Shermans that had fired earlier vanished, replaced by fresh vehicles lying silent in new ambush sites. The Panthers, advancing cautiously toward where they thought the enemy remained, found only empty fields, until American shells slammed into their exposed sides yet again. Frustration mounted inside German turrets. Their crews had been trained to expect dominance, told that the Panther was invincible in frontal combat. Instead, they found themselves outmaneuvered by what they still considered inferior machines. Every attempt to form a coherent line dissolved into skirmishes against an invisible, mobile foe. By midday, the battlefield was littered with wreckage. The Americans had not only inflicted losses but shattered German confidence. At Arracourt, firepower alone meant nothing. Adaptability, speed, and communication turned 5 Shermans into a force far greater than the sum of their parts. By the afternoon of September 19th, the duel between Shermans and Panthers had spread across the rolling hills of Lorraine. But the Germans quickly learned they weren't just fighting American tanks. They were fighting an entire battlefield system. Every time a Panther tried to maneuver into open ground, the earth itself seemed to erupt beneath its treads. The source was American artillery, pre-sighted and ready to fire at the first report of enemy movement. U.S. forward observers, crouched in church towers and tree lines, relayed coordinates through the same radio network that bound the Shermans together. Within minutes, batteries of 105mm howitzers thundered from the rear, their shells shrieking down to blast apart German formations. Tanks that survived the ambushes often found themselves immobilized by artillery fire, their engines disabled, their tracks shattered. For the men of the 113th Panzer Brigade, it was a new kind of warfare, one where even unseen opponents could strike with surgical precision. The skies, too, belonged to the Americans. When fog lifted briefly in the late afternoon, squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts swept overhead. Each carried rockets and bombs designed to rip through armored vehicles. Panthers that strayed too far from cover became easy prey, their camouflage no match for the eyes of pilots circling high above. German tankers later recalled the horror of hearing the whistle of diving aircraft, followed by the shattering impact of ordnance that flipped tanks like toys. What struck the Germans most was not just the presence of artillery and aircraft, but the coordination between all elements. Shermans would pin enemy armor in place, forcing them into predictable positions, while artillery rained destruction from a distance. If any Panthers broke free, thunderbolts swooped in to finish the job. The battlefield became a symphony of interlocking threats, each amplifying the other until the Germans felt as though the very environment was conspiring against them. For the Americans, this was doctrine in action. They understood that tanks alone did not win battles. Combined arms did. At Arracourt, 5 Shermans seemed to accomplish the impossible, not because of raw strength, but because they fought as part of a larger war machine. For the 113th Panzer Brigade, that realization came too late, as their losses mounted with every passing hour. For the German crews of the 113th Panzer Brigade, the battlefield at Arracourt quickly became a place of dread. Many had entered the campaign brimming with confidence, convinced their Panthers would brush aside American Shermans like paper targets. Yet by the second day, the reality before them was undeniable. Their mighty machines were burning across the fields of Lorraine, and the enemy they dismissed as inferior had shattered their advance. The psychological blow was immense. Tank warfare had always been about confidence as much as firepower. German propaganda had told these young recruits that the Panther was untouchable, its gun superior, its armor impenetrable. But inside those steel hulls with shells slamming against their sides and artillery shaking the ground, the myth dissolved. Crews began to whisper doubts, wondering how Shermans, in smaller numbers, were somehow dictating every engagement. Veterans noticed the shift immediately. Some officers reported crews hesitating to press forward, fearing the unseen ambushes that seemed to spring from every hedgerow. Others grew reluctant to leave cover, knowing that artillery would punish any exposed movement. Even when the Panthers managed to line up frontal duels, the Americans rarely obliged, choosing instead to slip away, regroup, and strike again from the flank. It was as if the battlefield itself favored the Shermans, and the Germans were trapped in a rigged contest. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies revealed the disbelief that spread through the brigade. The Americans fought like hunters, one survivor later wrote, always appearing from where we least expected them. Our tanks were powerful, but we could not use them. It was like having a sword against an enemy with many spears. This loss of faith in the weapon they relied upon cut deeper than the physical losses themselves. Meanwhile, the Sherman's crews felt their morale surge. Each Panther destroyed reinforced their conviction that they could outfight the supposedly superior machine. Where the Germans saw frustration and futility, the Americans saw validation of their doctrine. The psychological battlefield shifted decisively, with German confidence crumbling and American resolve hardening. At Arracourt, the Panthers were not just defeated in steel, they were defeated in spirit. The shock of failure gnawed at German soldiers who had expected glory, leaving them haunted by the realization that superiority on paper meant nothing against an enemy who refused to fight by their rules. As reports of the disaster at Arracourt reached higher German command, disbelief quickly gave way to frustration. Hitler had promised that the Panther would spearhead a reversal of fortunes in the West, yet in Lorraine, it had failed spectacularly. Generals on the ground were forced to admit what many had long suspected. Heavy armor alone could not win battles when fuel, reconnaissance, and combined armed support were absent. The 113th Panzer Brigade's losses stunned even hardened officers. Nearly half of its Panthers had been destroyed within days, not in sweeping clashes of massed armor, but in small, chaotic duels where American units dictated the terms. German commanders realized they had committed their tanks blindly, with little reconnaissance, no artillery synchronization, and almost no air cover. It was a textbook case of ignoring the fundamentals of modern warfare. Yet the response from Berlin was tragically predictable. Rather than rethinking the reliance on massive armored formations, Hitler doubled down. He clung to the belief that heavier tanks, first the Panther, then the Tiger II, could break Allied lines through sheer mechanical dominance. But Arracourt proved the opposite. Without coordination, those tanks became vulnerable monuments to wasted resources. American doctrine, by contrast, was vindicated. The U.S. Army had never intended for the Sherman to duel Panthers head-on. Instead, it was part of a combined arms team, supported by mobile artillery, engineers, and above all, air power. At Arracourt, this doctrine had worked flawlessly. While Shermans maneuvered aggressively, artillery blanketed German staging areas, and when the fog cleared, Allied fighter bombers swooped down to finish the job. The irony was bitter for German soldiers. They had once pioneered blitzkrieg, the doctrine of mobility, surprise, and combined arms coordination. Yet by 1944, strangled by fuel shortages and unrealistic orders, they had abandoned those very principles. Arracourt highlighted how far the Wehrmacht had drifted from its earlier brilliance. Instead of flexible tactics, it relied on brute force, and brute force alone could not overcome American depth of resources. For German officers reviewing the battle, the lesson was clear but unheeded. Tanks without coordination were death traps. Arracourt had exposed the myth that technical superiority could replace strategy. But with Hitler's grip tightening, the German army marched further into delusion, convinced that more armor would solve problems that were fundamentally strategic. Arracourt was not just a battlefield defeat, it was a doctrinal collapse. The Panthers' failure revealed that Germany had learned nothing from its own past successes, while the Americans had mastered the very principles the Wehrmacht had once pioneered. By late September 1944, the chaos of Arracourt had settled into a clear American triumph. The 4th Armored Division, battered but unbroken, had repelled multiple German thrusts, turning what was supposed to be a decisive counteroffensive into a ruinous defeat for the Wehrmacht. Where German commanders had hoped to shatter Patton's flank, they instead left Lorraine littered with burned-out Panthers and the demoralized remnants of 2 Panzer brigades. The consolidation phase was just as crucial as the fighting itself. Major General John S. Wood's division did not rest on its laurels. Engineers quickly repaired damaged bridges and roads, while supply convoys surged forward to keep Shermans, half-tracks, and artillery fueled and ready. The lesson was obvious. The Americans could not only win in sudden engagements, they could also sustain momentum, something Germany, crippled by shortages, could no longer achieve. Artillery once again played a decisive role. Batteries shifted to interdict retreating German formations, preventing them from reorganizing. Infantry regiments swept through the countryside, rounding up stragglers and ensuring that German armored thrusts could not regroup for another surprise. What remained of the Panzer brigades was no longer a coherent fighting force, but scattered survivors trying to slip back east. The impact rippled beyond Lorraine. Arracourt demonstrated that American armored divisions were no longer green forces learning under fire. They had become seasoned units capable of facing Germany's best and emerging victorious. Confidence soared among Patton's men, who now viewed the Panther not as an invincible predator, but as a target to be outmaneuvered and destroyed. German morale, by contrast, sank. Survivors admitted privately that their losses were catastrophic, not only in equipment, but in faith. They had been promised that the Western Allies could be thrown back if only they fought with determination. Arracourt proved that no amount of determination could overcome America's combination of flexible tactics and boundless resources. The wider Lorraine campaign now tilted decisively in America's favor. Patton's Third Army secured critical ground, while the Luftwaffe remained too depleted to challenge Allied air supremacy. German hopes of stabilizing the front with fresh armored brigades had evaporated in smoke and wreckage. Arracourt was more than a localized engagement. It was a turning point. It confirmed that the Wehrmacht had passed its zenith and that the Americans had arrived as the new masters of mechanized warfare. The consolidation after battle ensured that victory at Arracourt would resonate far beyond Lorraine, reshaping the momentum of the entire campaign. The smoke cleared over Lorraine, but the echoes of Arracourt stretched far beyond the French countryside. What had begun as a desperate German gamble became a defining lesson in modern armored warfare. 5 Shermans, thought to be outmatched by Panthers, had not only held their ground but shattered entire German formations. The battle disproved the myth of German invincibility and revealed that in war, victory depended not on the thickness of armor, but on the skill of crews. the adaptability of commanders, and the strength of the supply chain that kept them fighting. For decades, the Sherman tank carried an unfair reputation as a death trap. Arracourt tells a different story. Here, Sherman's outmaneuvered Panthers exploited terrain and demonstrated that reliability and numbers could triumph over mechanical sophistication. American crews trusted their machines, and their ability to coordinate armor, artillery, and air power gave them an edge Germany could never reclaim. The legacy extended to the men themselves. Veterans of Arracourt carried the memory of that battle as proof that their training, courage, and resilience had broken the back of a formidable opponent. Oral histories and post-war memoirs recall the pride of defeating Panthers, with weapons critics dismissed as inferior. For the Germans, however, Arracourt became a bitter symbol of futility. Even the most advanced tanks could not compensate for dwindling fuel, limited replacements, and an enemy whose industrial base dwarfed their own. Strategically, Arracourt reinforced a truth already clear to military planners. Germany's time was over. The Wehrmacht could no longer launch meaningful offensives in the West. The initiative had permanently shifted to the Allies, who would press forward relentlessly toward the Rhine. By the end of 1944, Germany was fighting a defensive war on all fronts, and its defeat was only a matter of time. In the grand arc of World War II, Arracourt occupies a special place. It was not the largest clash of tanks, nor the bloodiest, but it was decisive in proving that the American way of war, logistics, coordination, and relentless pressure, could overcome even the most feared German weapons. The battle redefined perceptions, silenced doubts, and demonstrated that when courage met ingenuity, even 5 Shermans could turn the tide against dozens of Panthers. Arracourt's legacy endures as a reminder that warfare is as much about adaptation as it is about firepower. In the rolling hills of Lorraine, the future of armored combat was decided, and it was the Americans who left as masters of the battlefield.